If you are interested in teaching poetry, whether in elementary school, middle school, high school, even at the college level, or even retreats and fellowships, one of the things that I see over and over again is pedagogical strategies that have existed for hundreds of years that maybe are a little bit out of date. My name is Jeff. I'm an ESL teacher teaching English as a second language, and one of the things I've learned from teaching English as a second language to people who are complete beginners at times at English in a new language is that there are some strategies that can lead to effective teaching that aren't really just for that specific industry, but that can actually apply to any field that you're in, including if we're teaching poetry. One of the issues that we see a lot with modern ways that professors and teachers are approaching poetry in the classroom is they're relying on a couple of concepts that can actually make it more difficult for students to take in the knowledge. A couple of things. For instance, a lot of the formats are based on a whole group approach where there's a teacher at the front of the classroom, there's students around them, the teacher asks the question to everyone, and the students who are more vocal have a chance to dominate. Another thing that we see a lot in poetry classrooms is an idea called high teacher talk time, where basically the teachers just dominate. If you were to create a ratio of teacher talk time to student talk time, there's a bit of a dichotomy because the teachers tend to dominate, maybe 75% of the time, if not more, leaving only 25% of the time to students. That is also a problem. Additionally, a lot of the approaches to teaching are based entirely on kind of single approaches to intelligence. There's not much that's incorporating body kinesthetic. There's not necessarily a lot that's tying in other senses, for instance, like hearing. We want to see if we can move beyond just purely visual, getting students the opportunity to move out of their seat, getting students opportunities to pair what they're working with visuals or audio cues can also be helpful for helping them acquire knowledge. The last thing I want to highlight is that a lot of times professors and teachers are not really thinking about obstacles to learning, especially concepts, for instance, like what we can call the affective filter. Basically, if a student has a high affective filter, that can mean that they're feeling stressed out, they're feeling under pressure. This can be because of things happening at home, but it can also be because of things that are happening inside the classroom. For instance, if a student is shy and a teacher is using a teaching method that is based on whole group discussion, well, that shy student might feel pressured to speak even if they don't feel comfortable speaking. So there's a couple of techniques that we can do as facilitators, as instructors, as teachers to not only make the classroom environment more conducive to learning, but actually more enjoyable for our students' experience as well. I want to highlight some approaches that you can start using in your own teaching at any level of education today. The first strategy I want to highlight is a strategy called test, teach, test. Imagine that when a student walks into a room, on their desk is a paper that's already immediately asking them questions. Now, we want to make sure that this test, quote unquote, is not immediately giving students a sense of pressure and stress. So what we can do is say, hey, this isn't a grade. I just want you guys to answer these questions and see how you do. What this does is it gives students an opportunity to see what information they already know. It gives them a chance to prime themselves for the topic that the class is about to discuss. And it also is going to make whatever happens after the test become a lot more relevant to the student too, because they're going to be thinking about all of those topics that they're going to find on that test paper at their desk. This can also help with a concept called washback, which is all the information that student takes after a test to then apply to their own learning and growth. This can lead to some positive washback because basically after that initial test, you can then teach the concepts that are on that test you gave at the beginning, and then you can give the test once more and see the improvement. So it can be very rewarding for students because it can be, oh, at the beginning of class, you gave me this test, I didn't do that well on it. But then at the end of the class, when I got to take it again, I knew immediately what was being discussed. Another strategy that I like to use a lot in the classroom is called a dictogloss. It works a little bit like this. You put students into pairs. You have a text that you're working with. For instance, maybe you're introducing a new poetic form, maybe for instance a sonnet. And what you can do is outside of your classroom or at the far end of your classroom, you can take a sonnet that you want to work with, put it onto the wall with tape, then give one piece of paper to each pair of students. One person is going to be the scribe, the other person is going to be the runner. What happens is the runner goes to check out the sonnet or the form or the poem you want to work with. They then have to come back to the scribe and tell them what they see. And so what begins happening is they need to run back and forth to kind of remember the information and think about, oh, they said this line. And so you can start to piece together things slowly because you're going to forget. You can't remember an entire sonnet, in just 2 seconds. So you need to make multiple trips. You start paying attention to elements of grammar. You start paying attention to lines, to line breaks, to punctuation. Whatever the element is that you want to focus on, they're going to need to start including as they tell their partner what to write down. The goal is that by the end of the exercise, you've rewritten the poem exactly as it appears in your model. It can be a fun way to introduce new concepts without having to say anything directly yourself, as the students are going to start noticing some things on their own. Another activity that ties in a lot of body kinesthetic is a concept called stations, which is actually very similar to what we just saw with the dictogloss. For stations, what you do is, let's say, for instance, you want to do some analysis, some poetry analysis of haiku, but you don't just want to have students sit at a desk and answer whole group questions. Well, what you can do is, let's say there's 4 haiku that you want your students to work with. You can post them around the room, maybe put a piece of butcher paper or large paper beside each haiku, and then put a question on that butcher paper. After that, you can group students. So let's say you have 4 haiku you're working with. That means you need 4 groups of students. And each group goes to a different haiku. They see a question. They need to talk to their partners in their group about the question, and they need to write an answer at that haiku. And then they move to the next station when you tell them to. So this can be a nice warm-up activity to get students moving, talking to each other in a safer environment, which is going to lead into another topic that we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, this allows students to give answers and test themselves and check their comprehension in a much safer setting than in a whole group. It also allows them to get their blood flowing a little bit, see different parts of the room, move around before needing to sit back down. Another concept that can be very helpful in the classroom is finding ways to engage students in role plays. Role plays, again, basically you have students take on different characters. So if, for instance, if you're working with a sonnet or maybe a poetry form with different characters, you could have the students try to enact the scenes or whatever is happening, the action of the poem. Maybe have them turn it into a different form of art, for instance, like a play. You could have them give stage directions. This can just help students to really put themselves in the situation that the poem is describing. It can make it feel a little bit more real to them. And then they can start imagining themselves as the actual characters and maybe trying to think about, oh, what are the emotions that the poem is conveying? How are the lines actually working? What are the actions actually describing? There's this metaphor or there's this simile. How do I capture that with my own body or with my own characters and things? This is where role plays can be very helpful. It's also something that's very student-led, so the teachers don't necessarily have to take on the role of directing everything. Instead, they're facilitating, trying to get the different interpretations. The teacher can also use this as an opportunity to comprehension check based on how the students are performing with the role play. They can get an idea of like, oh, this part of the poem, they seem to understand, but this other part of the poem, they're having a hard time capturing. Let's make sure that they're understanding what is occurring in this part of the poem. The last strategy that I really would encourage you to think about if you are leading a classroom is an age-old strategy called think, pair, share. So this is, again, is in direct contrast to a whole group where the teacher asks the whole classroom a question and the whole class has a chance to answer. Instead, imagine that the teacher asks a question, but instead of immediately taking answers, all the students have a single partner, or maybe in groups of 3. I wouldn't recommend having groups larger than 3, because once you get to 4 or 5, there's usually a couple students who dominate, and then there's other students who get left out. 3 is a number that tends to avoid that dynamic. So having groups of 3, when you ask a question in their group, they get to think by themselves for a moment and then get to share with their partners. As that's happening, the teacher can go around the room to again check for comprehension among the students, kind of see what's going on. And then once that's finished, you can then move back into a whole group. This makes a whole group setting feel much more comfortable because students have had time to prepare their own thoughts. If they don't know what to say for themselves, they also don't need to speak for themselves. They can speak for their partner. They could say, oh, well, in our group, we discussed this, or, you know, Mike said this. And that can also take away some of the stress that comes with being in a whole group setting for students who don't really prefer that. Do you have some other teaching strategies that you think work well in the classroom for poetry exercises? Be sure to let us know below. And if you're looking for more poetry workshops on all different elements of poetry, craft, business, whatever it may be sure to check out more Poet Business Institute workshops.